In 1934, Alcatraz, the United States federal government's ultimate adaptive containment experiment, opened its doors, and it was built like the Roach Motel, you know. You could check in, but you can't check out because Alcatraz was built to be inescapable. Now, this isn't your typical escape from Alcatraz story because the method of how Frank Morris, John Anglin, and Clarence Anglin escaped on the night of June 11, 1962 isn't really the how that's in the official narrative. And it will explain why the escape-proof prison was shut down shortly after their escape. I would love to have Leonard Nimoy tell this story, but unfortunately, he is not available at this time. So you're stuck with me. This would be right up his alley. So, in 1898, a psychologist named Edward Thorndike. Yes, this is about Alcatraz, hold on. Well, Thorndike built a series of wooden crates. He called them puzzle boxes. Inside each box, or as we can refer to them here, inside each mini Alcatraz, he placed a hungry cat. Al Capone wasn't born yet. He wasn't born until 1899, so he wasn't available at that time. So Thorndike had to settle for a hungry cat in his Alcatraz. Oh, gotcha. You didn't know Al Capone. If you didn't, he would end up being one of the residents of the much larger Alcatraz, you know, the real one. So back on track. So Thorndike put his hungry cat in a box, and then just out of reach, he placed a piece of fish. Well, at first, the cats did what any trapped animal would do. They clawed at the wood and bit at the bars. They fought with blind, frantic force. They were mad, just like the prisoners in Alcatraz would be some 36 years in the future. Eventually, by pure accident, a cat would stumble against a wire or step on a small wooden lever. The door would pop open, the cat gets to eat. Well, when Thorndike put the same cat back inside the box, something fascinating happened. The cat didn't get smarter or analyze the architect. Nope, it just simply remembered what worked. The random, useless scratching stopped, and when the cat was put in the box, the escape became almost instant. Well, they ain't stupid, right? Thorndike called this the law of effect. Actions that lead to a reward are repeated. Actions that lead to failure or death are abandoned. Don't let me lose you here. This relates directly to the failed attempts of the inmates trying to escape Alcatraz and how they succeeded later. Years later, psychologist B.F. Skinner would expand on this with his theories of operant conditioning. We're almost to the good stuff. I remember sitting in college learning about these people's names and their human behaviorism stuff and getting to, well, I had to stand up in the back of the room so I wouldn't fall asleep, damn it. Well, Skinner, though, he's a little bit more exciting than Thorndike because I believe Skinner would use low voltage electricity to condition the rats, like prisons would use high voltage to condition other prisoners. So Skinner's own experimental apparatus, they called it the Skinner box, proved that any subject, human or animal, placed inside a controlled environment would have its behavior systematically shaped by that environment over time through reinforcement, environmental penalties, and learned adaptations. The box itself, where a prison, became the teacher. Now, we're moving into more into what you might be more familiar with about Alcatraz. So imagine taking that exact psychological experiment and scaling it up to absolute human size. Imagine a puzzle box made out of tool-proof steel, solid granite, and millions of gallons of freezing treacherous water. A puzzle box built by the U.S. government, the United States federal government, that we call Alcatraz. And his first warden was James A. Johnson. He was handpicked by the federal government precisely because he was known as the most rigidly disciplined prison administrator in the country. His successor, Warden Edwin B. Swoop, would later inherit a prison that had already been hardened by years of failed escape attempts. But we'll get to that. For decades, the public was told a simple story. Alcatraz was a warehouse, a concrete tomb designed to hold America's most violent, irredeemable gangsters, men like Al Capone, Machine Gun Kelly, Barker and the infamous Birdman of Alcatraz, also known as Robert Stroud, a convicted murderer who became one of the most studied criminal figures in American penal history. And then there was Alvin Creepy Carpus, the longest serving prisoner in Alcatraz's entire history, who spent 26 freaking years inside those damn walls. But if you step back and look at the raw data, a different, far more chilling picture begins to emerge. Over 29 years, Alcatraz held a very specific sample size of 36 men. Across those 29 years, those men launched exactly 14 separate escape attempts. And every single time an inmate tried to beat the system, the prison did something incredible. It watched, and it learned, and it adapted. You see, the public thought Alcatraz was a static prison, but the inmates quickly realized the terrifying truth. Alcatraz was a living trap, a government-engineered Skinner box scaled to fit humans inside. A puzzle box only works if it fixes its own mistakes. Every time a prisoner discovered a blind spot, a weak bar, or a flaw in the guard schedule, that prisoner unwittingly handed the government a blueprint. The early inmates did the messy, dangerous groundwork. They tested the boundaries, and with every failed attempt, the prison authorities processed the data, patched the hole, and made the maze harder. To understand how the trap learned, we have to look at the man who paid the price. On April the 27th, 1936, an inmate by the name of Joe Bowers was assigned duty at the Islands incinerator, right near the outer edge of the prison grounds. For months, Bowers watched the shoreline. He looked at the chain-link fences. He timed the guards in the distant towers, and on a quiet afternoon, Bowers made his move. He threw himself onto the chain-link fence and began to climb frantically towards the sky. Well, a guard spotted him and yelled for him to come down. Well, Bowers didn't want to, and he kept trying to climb, desperate for a taste of freedom. So the guard did what any prison guard with a rifle would do, and Bowers ended up shot through the chest and plunging 50 feet down into a jagged rocks below. I don't know if the bullet killed him or if the sudden stop at the bottom, but one of the things for sure, he was dead, not alive. But look at what happened next. The warden didn't just bury Joe Bowers. He studied the details. He looked at exactly where the guard was standing and realized the outer perimeter had a visual blind spot. Within weeks, the federal government repositioned the guard towers, added a high-powered spotlights, and ordered the guards to shoot to kill on sight, which I guess makes it so the guards don't have to feel like they have to ask the prisoners to stop doing whatever they're doing, just shoot them. So the next inmate, Nell knows, don't do what Bowers did unless you want to end up like Bowers. On the next test, on December the 16th, 1937, two bank robbers named Theodore Cole, and my research said he liked to be called Ted, and Ralph Rowe, who just went by Ralph, found a new weakness. They realized the prison's weak point wasn't the guards, it was the building. They worked in the prison workshop, right on the edge of the island. Over several agonizing weeks, I'm sure every week was agonizing there, they used tiny, smuggled hacksaw blades. They silently cut through the iron bars of a workshop window. Now, to hide the cuts, they filled the cracks with grease and dirt. On that December morning, a massive, blinding fog rolled across San Francisco Bay. You couldn't see 5 feet in front of your face. Ted and Ralph made their run. That's what they called it back in the day when a prisoner tries to escape, making their run. They kicked out the bars of the window, slipped through the gap, and dropped into the freezing churning water. I don't know what they were thinking, but damn. But they did vanish into the white mist, and the Coast Guard searching for them for weeks, but didn't find nothing. Officially, the men were listed as drowned, but their bodies never were recovered, but that's because they think it was pushed out to the Pacific Ocean. Now, here's something some people don't know. The prison official would brag about their secret weapon regarding inmates trying to swim across the water, and ain't sharks. Alcatraz was the only federal prison at the time that had mandatory, you had to do this even if you don't want to. They had mandatory hot showers. Every inmate was required to take hot showers. That's so that if they made it to the water, their body would not be accustomed to cold water, and when they try to swim in the 50-degree or 48-degree water, or even 53, depending on the time of the year, but 53 ain't very warm. But even when they try to swim in the water, their body would cramp up and, well, they would drown. On a side note, think about these two again when we talk about the very last inmate on this episode. Well, after that, the government realized that flat iron bars were too soft. Much like my brother-in-law. The Bureau of Prisons spent thousands of dollars replacing every single bar and every window on Alcatraz. They replaced them with a brand new material called tool-proof steel alloy. This was a metal so hard it would mess up a hacksaw blade just about on contact. It's also when guards were ordered to start conducting sudden, random head counts throughout the day. By 1946, the prison had defeated 9 escape attempts. The inmates were getting desperate, and they realized they couldn't sneak out the box. They had to fight their way out. Maybe. In May 1946, the 10th escape attempt began, later known as the Bloody Battle of Alcatraz. An inmate by the name of Bernard Cole spent months tracking the main guard routines in his cell house. He noticed a fatal design flaw. The elevated gun gallery, where a single guard walked with a rifle, it was protected by iron bars that were just slightly wider than the average width. Coy spent weeks starving himself so he could lose weight. He built a makeshift mechanical bar. It was a spreader. He made it out of scrap metal pipes and bolts. And on May the 2nd, Coy made his run. He used his device to silently bend the gallery bars apart, squeezed his emancipated body through the gap, and he ambushed a guard from behind. Man, that dude must have been sleeping. He stole the keys and the weapons, and for 3 terrifying days, Alcatraz became a war zone. I think it was more terrorizing for the inmates because the inmates locked themselves in, which wasn't too hard to do since they were already locked in prison. I guess I should say they locked the guards out and then started trading gunfire with them. Unfortunately for the inmates, the United States Marines arrived to help the guards. The Marines decided that deploying heavy artillery and blowing the inmates to smithereens was too easy, that they would get fancy. They decided to show off and drill some holes into the roof of the cell house and drop fragmentation grenades down onto the rioters. My experience is that everyone that likes to play with things that blow things up, well, that would be the Marines for you. That worked out well for the Marines, but not so well for the inmates as you would think. Coy was killed in that Marine exercise. The inmates really should have given up as soon as the Marines showed up, I think, because this was 1946 and World War II had just ended about 2 years before. And I'm sure there were several Marines that had been in that war, and this was not their first rodeo dropping hand grenades on dumbasses. The Battle of Alcatraz reshaped how the prison operated. Violence was a dead end. Seriously. Any alarm triggered an automatic island-wide lockdown, and the 1946 response had proven that authorities would escalate as far as it took, up to and including shooting their asses with some military assistance to end the prisoner uprising. In the aftermath, administrators patched the gun gallery with reinforced mesh, changed the key codes, and retrained the entire staff. Then, by early 1960s, 12 escape attempts had come and gone. Alcatraz had absorbed every method its inmates could derive, and they shut the door on each and every one. Then came 13th man. In January 1960, a prisoner entered the box of Alcatraz. His name was Frank Morris. Morris was not a violent gangster or a muscle-bound enforcer. He was a master burglar with an incredible sharp mind. He looked at Alcatraz and did not see static walls. He saw 26 years of institutional history. Morris spent his first months on the island studying the history and the failures before him. He realized that trying to overpower the guards or cut the window bars was a trap within a trap. The prison had already upgraded its defenses against those exact methods anyway. If he wanted to get out, he needed to find a path that the prison had never tested so he can get his fish. He needed to be like that hungry cat that wanted that fish, you know what I mean? He needed to find a variable the government had forgotten to calculate. This legendary breakout would later inspire the 1969 Hollywood film Escape from Alcatraz, starring Mr. Clint Eastwood himself. Here's a picture of him from the Marine Corps. He wasn't in the Marines, he was on a Marine Corps base. Well, this cemented their story into global pop culture because it's Clint Eastwood. So Morris joined forces with a prisoner named Allen West and two brothers, John and Clarence Anglin. Together, they looked at the structure of the cell house. Right behind their cell walls was a dark, narrow utility corridor packed with plumbing pipes. This corridor was completely unmonitored. Now, the only thing to separate their cells from this hidden gemstone of a hallway was a small concrete ventilation grate. Because Alcatraz sat on an island inside San Francisco Bay, surrounded by corrosive salt water, the air was highly corrosive, like the salt water. Morris examined the concrete around his vent and realized it was old and damp and rotted. The puzzle box had been hiding a structural weakness, and the government hadn't figured it out yet. That's the thing. If you're trying to keep people where they don't want to be, then you have to stay on your toes and keep exercising your mentalities. That means you got to think longer and harder than the other person and look for what it is. Well, you need to look for the whats, the ifs, and the what-fos. Because Morris knew that knowing the flaw was only half the battle, and he needed to exploit it without triggering alarms. The group knew from the 1946 battle that noise would bring instant trouble, and probably in the form of termination, probably with extreme prejudice. They couldn't use loud tools, so they turned everyday items against the prison itself. They stole silver spoons from the mess hall, made them into chisels, and when the spoon handles bent under the pressure, they stole a broken vacuum cleaner motor from the prison workshop and figured out how to make it into a power drill. For hours every night during the prison's designated music hour, the men dug into the rotted walls because the music would drown out their noise. That sounded like the string instruments and accordions echoing through that block. Yep, that did it. That's weird that they let people do that. As Forrest Gump would say, that's all I got to say about that. But that's kind of weird in a stupid kind of way. So there's that. These guys placed false grates over the holes to hide their progress from the guards walking the roads. The hole in the wall was only the first step. The data from the 1937 escape proved that freezing waters of the bay would kill any man who tried to swim. Now, I'm sure you remember the mandatory hot showers. To beat the water, they needed a boat. Over several months, the men systematically stole over 50 plastic raincoats. They built this secret workshop in the upper levels of the cell house right above their block. That's a hell of a thing that they even had the space to do so. They used the heat from the prison's own exposed steam pipes to melt and fuse the edges of the raincoats together. They manufactured a 6 by 14 foot inflatable raft. That's a hell of a good boat. They even carved wooden paddles from scrap wood and built a pump out of a musical instrument accordion to inflate it. That was, I believe, one of the brothers, maybe. They were building an entire naval escape kit right under the noses of the guards. Guess they were trying to be like MacGyver, but only 50 years before MacGyver was even MacGyver. And they probably didn't even use chewing gum. By June of 1962, their plan was ready. But Morris knew the absolute biggest obstacle was not the concrete or the water, it was the guards. They walked the cell tiers every single hour of the night, and they checked each bed. If a guard noticed an empty cell, The roost was up. The alarms would be sounded instantly, and the island would go into lockdown, and they'd be screwed or shot, which could be both. They needed to figure out They needed a hack to use on the guards. So for weeks, the men worked with soap, concrete dust, toilet paper, and paint, and I heard somewhere wax, to sculpture realistic dummy heads. They visited the prison barber shop and quietly collected real human hair from the floor and glued it into the sculptures. On the night of June 11, 1962, they made their run. They placed the dummy heads on their pillows and tucked blankets up to their chins because they didn't get no body. The final execution of the plan brought an unexpected dramatic tension. As the hour arrived to slip away, Alan West found himself trapped. I hadn't talked too much about him, but we have mentioned him already. West did go in and out of his cell during all this months-long prep phase, same as the other three. All four of them were chipping at their vent openings every night. They climbed up into the cell block's top utility area to work on the raft, then returning to their cells before the morning count. West was up there helping build the raft and the life vest that they used. The reason he got stuck on the final night, well, to keep the guards from spotting all the work, all four men had packed their vent openings with fake wall. It was concrete dust mixed with paint, painted to match the surrounding wall, held in place with cardboard. They'd remove the fake panel to go in and out, and then they'd reseat it. West's setup was different. At some point during the months of digging, different will get you not escaped. So at some point during the months of digging, he noticed the concrete around his vent was crumbling more than he wanted it. So he cemented his fake panel in place to keep it from falling out and giving away the operation. Nice boy. He thought he could break it back out quickly when the night came. You could think on one hand, and it didn't work out for him because on June the 11th, he couldn't, because the cement holding his fake panel held tighter than he expected. And by the time he finally chipped his way out, the other three were gone. So it wasn't that the vent suddenly jammed on the first time, or that was not the first time, but it's not like it jammed the first time he used it. It's that West had sealed his own exit shut with cement as a security measure and underestimated how long it would take to reopen it. The structural reinforcements around his specific cell wall ventilation panel jammed, causing him to fall behind schedule. Realizing the weight would jeopardize the entire operation, Morris and Anglin were forced to leave the fourth conspirator behind. Like I said, they were gone. The deception worked perfectly for the remaining three. During the nightly head counts, the guards looked into the dim cells, saw what appeared to be sleeping bodies, and kept on walking. While the guards kept walking their loops, Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers crawled through the widened ventilation holes and entered the utility corridor. They climbed the plumbing pipes to the top of the cell house and forced open a massive roof ventilator and slipped out of the roof. On a side note, those screws on the ventilator were made out of soap because they'd already taken the real ones out and replaced them with soap ones and painted them so the guards wouldn't notice. They carried their heavy raincoat raft down 50 feet of external plumbing pipes, scaled the final perimeter fence, and reached the dark, rocky shoreline. Well, they connected their makeshift pump, inflated the raft, and launched themselves into the pitch black water and vanished into the night, paddling through the rough currents toward Angel Island, which is just about a mile from the prison walls. The next morning, the guards walked up to Frank Morris's cell to wake him up. When the inmate didn't respond, the guard reached through the bars and tapped the bed, and the dummy head rolled off the pillow and smacked against the floor. Oh, I'd hate to be him. The siren started, and I'm sure he was a hell of a mess. Then someone had to call the warden. I wouldn't want to be that guard. The warden stood in the empty cell, staring at the hole in the concrete wall. Well, the ultimate puzzle box had been solved. The FBI launched one of the largest manhunts in American history. They found remnants of the Raincoat Raft on a nearby island, but they never found the men. Officially, the government claims they drowned, but saying that no human could survive the freezing currents of the bay. However, just about 6 months later, another event shook that assumption to its core. In December of 1962, an inmate by the name of John Paul Scott managed to escape the island and successfully swim all the way across the San Francisco Bay to the mainland shore. We don't hear much about him. Maybe if he made a papier-mâché head of himself, he would be talked about a little bit more. But when John Paul Scott arrived, exhausted at Fort Point, which is the historic fortification sitting directly beneath the Golden Gate Bridge, well, John Paul Scott was found barely conscious and laying on the rocks, but he was 100% alive. They rescued him, which is a weird way of saying they arrested him again and locked him back up. But his survival demolished the government's argument that no one could survive the water. The bay was cold, brutal, and unforgiving, but it's not a guaranteed death sentence, which means the question of what happened to Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers is not a question of physical impossibility. It's simply a question of whether they made it to the other side before the currents took them out the other side to the Pacific. The true climax of this experience happened on March the 21st, 1963, less than a year after the escape. Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy issued a sudden order to shut down Alcatraz forever. The government's official explanation was that the prison was simply too expensive to operate and the salt air had ruined the infrastructure. Today, the island's preserved as part of the Golden Gate National Recreation Area, drawing over 1 million visitors, we're not done yet, so more, a year, who walk the same corridors where Morris and Anglin's made their run. Thorndike's cats stopped scratching the box once they knew how to open it. And the government closed Alcatraz once 3 men proved they could open it. Experiment was over. If you like this episode, go ahead and click the like button and let me know in the comments. And while you're at the comments, hit the hype button and I'll see you in the next episode of The Hidden Lens.